joining us today. This panel event is on African anti-colonial cinema, and we have a panel of esteemed guests. So we're going to start with Imruh giving an overview of sort of African anti-colonial cinema.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Fatuma and Torab for organizing this weekend, the other cinemas. I looked closely at the program in trying to think about what I might contribute here today, and I was very interested in the sort of depth of thought behind it. And you have a program of films here which I know people, if they knew it was happening, would be beating down those doors to come and see, okay? Because one or two of these films have just been restored to their pristine quality, and they are now being screened. This is one of the first screenings for Zambizanga, and I think Hyenas as well, Mandabi definitely, all just being recently restored as part of an archival initiative involving FEPASI, the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, the Cinematheque Bologna, and the Film Foundation, which is backed by Martin Scorsese, and maybe one or two, UNESCO, I think, as well. But an initiative that comes directly from the African filmmakers, particularly those who we will refer to as pioneers. This is their project, which they started many years ago. And a good friend of ours, June Giovanni, is here, of the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. So we're talking about archives. She knows about what this story is. And it's been curated by a good friend and colleague of ours, Abubakar Sanoko, who teaches in Canada. He's from Burkina Faso, and he's been working diligently for the last decade or so to make this possible, as well as others going forward. So when we are all gone and our wands are playing with us on the earth. Anyway, thank you very much. As I said, good to meet Tomisin and Awa here as well, as filmmakers, curators of the contemporary generation, which you probably know a lot more than I do, and I'm still wanting to see your films. What I suggested that I would do is a brief historical sketch, more or less to contextualize what we might be discussing and also the films which you're seeing. I was very interested that the title was Anti-Colonial African Cinema, because of course that presupposes a number of things. That there is another cinema other than anti-colonial African cinema, that there is a colonial cinema, which definitely there is, and then how do you position African cinema in relation to this? Is there another African cinema that is not anti-colonial at this moment? And I want to suggest that we could think about that a little bit. As I say, anti-colonialism presupposes and confirms that there is such a thing as colonialism. We are in an era where, I'm sure you know, everybody's talking about decolonialization, decolonialism, which means countering, correcting, reversing the legacies and the presences of colonialism which persist. We are also in an era where racism is very much part of the discourse. Black Lives Matter, which people are still trying to convince people that that is important. People are taking a knee, etc., etc. And I want to suggest that they're all linked in a way of providing a context for how we might think about the films which constitute the program and what we might say is African cinema. I want to suggest that colonialism is really a structural relationship. It's a relationship of dependency between those who conquer, those who plunder, and those who are being exploited. Racism I would suggest, is a psychotic condition. And I want us to understand what I mean by that. Racism is a psychotic, it's a state of madness. It's a state of insanity, which is used to justify colonialism. Racism has one function: white supremacy. Racism has no other function as an ideology except promoting, ensuring white supremacy. So you can see how that works within a colonial situation. Okay? This therefore means the way I would reframe the notion of anti-colonial African cinema is to say that this isn't necessarily a cinema, but a set of ideas, a set of concepts perhaps, a set of ways of thinking or evaluating African cinema in all its aspects, from wherever it comes. And when we say Africa, we mean from the Mediterranean to the South Pole. From Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, to South Africa, Mozambique, Angola. Tanzania in the east, Ghana in the west, Nigeria somewhere in between, okay? but I'm talking about the whole continent. So therefore, as a pretext as a sort of preface to talking about African cinema, those kind of definitions I think are quite important, because it is out of this that we begin to see what are the anti-colonial aspects of this cinema, in whatever form it might be. And when we talk about that, we are really referring to what is the purpose of African cinema. It must have a purpose. Hollywood has a purpose. And I would suggest to you, the purpose is not entertainment. There is no such thing simply as entertainment. I was reading something today about Dune 2, and another blockbuster, which is just entertainment. But people who are wiser than I am, probably more knowledgeable than I am, will tell you that Dune is not as an innocent piece of work. I was reading also that there's a set of films coming out about Afghanistan, the recent conflict. And they're all about white journalists or heroes saving people from Afghanistan. Tarzan types, etc., etc. The white savior, the white missionary, rescuing the Afghanis, etc. So I'm told that's the next wave of Hollywood films you're going to see coming out. Now, why are these films being made? And this relates to the psychotic condition of racism that I talked about. These films are needed. Films are, as somebody said, all theorists will tell you, all historians will tell you, films like novels, like fables, like stories, are the stories people tell themselves to understand who they are, right? That's why there's a British cinema, a French cinema, an African cinema. These are the stories a community, a nation, a people tells itself to understand who it is. And in so doing, they normalize certain ideas. Hollywood needs niggers. Hollywood needs Negroes. Hollywood needs something they call blacks. They even need something they call Africans. But these don't relate to real people. They are figments of their imagination that allows them to tell certain stories that reaffirms their own identities. So you can see where the madness is framed in the telling of the story, right? They are able to tell themselves that this is what it is. And in Europe, black people are needed in order to maintain white privilege. If you go to Europe, they talk about Zwart Piet, the Dutch, Black Pete, gollywogs, all this sort of stuff. It's changed. Of course, the language has changed. The discourse hasn't changed. So the psychotic notion of white supremacy is being fed only in different ways. Okay? So therefore, cinema becomes important in this way. So my first point, cinema arrived in Africa a few months after it was invented in Europe. 1895, the first screening in Paris. Films were seen in African territories, North Africa, West Africa, and South Africa, within a few months. So that Africa is not, alien to the cinema. Interestingly, as cinema developed in Europe, it was the underclasses who flocked to the cinemas, whereas in Africa, it was the elites. And that has to do with associating with the colonized metropole. Whereas in the metropole, cinema was seen as low culture. Those who went to the opera or the theater didn't want to have anything to do with cinema. They began to take cinema seriously when sound came in. 1927, there was a film called The Jazz Singer. Nothing to do with jazz. A singer, of course, but nothing to do with jazz. Jazz was appropriated as a way of marketing this notion. But after that, it was realized that cinema was important to the culture of the 20th century, and we can see where it has become. Because the underclass could talk. The migrant in Hollywood, the Italian migrants, the Mexicans, could speak. And because they could speak, they could say things that were not permissible or could be seen as threatening. Now you transport that to Africa, laws were put in place by 1934, for example, and by 1927 in Britain, to prevent Africans from making films. There are legislations in the French, legal system that tells you that. This famous Laval decree. It lasted for about 40 years. British colonial film policy, 1927 till about 1960 or something like that. The dates may be a little, wrong or something, but generally, the period. The whole point was, one, from the French point of view as one approach, to stop Africans making films. The second, from the British point of view, was to make films for Africans and train Africans to make films that the British wanted them to make. And interestingly, that model developed in its, you might say, best effective mechanism in South Africa. Apartheid cinema was based on that. South Africa has been making films since the early years, 1916, 90, they began making films in South Africa. Then they're making films for black people. Then they make Bantu films, okay? So you can see that beginning to happen. Britain had a policy of colonial films, okay? So when we begin to see the emergence or the presence, the experience of Africa, of cinema in Africa, and the ability of Africans to make films are two different things. Africans had been watching films from day one, but not when they were able to make films relates to the post-war period after 1945. And a number of things kicked in to make that possible. Don't forget a whole anti-colonial movement, which an important point is the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, out of which people like Kwame Nkrumah, etc., came to then develop independent states in Africa. They were also a cultural movement among African artists and writers. In 1956, the first Congress of, as it was called, the Negro Writers and Artists. There was another Congress in 1959. And of course, there was an organization in Paris, which still exists, called Présence Africaine. Very important journal, but a research community. Among them, Émile Césaire came out of that, Cheikh Anta Diop, if those who study African history and so on, they were all part of that. Anybody who was an intellectual in Paris really was part of that. And they published, they ran conferences and so on. Don't forget people like C.L.R. James came to Britain in the 1930s as well. They were not necessarily part of Présence Africaine, but they were part of that global movement of African people in the metropole fighting and pushing back against colonialism. And then you had the OAU, which is now the AU. Began in 1963, Organization of African Independent States. And in that period, probably the last point I'd like to make is the Pan-African Festival in Algeria, 1969. So all of this has helped to shape the emergence of African filmmakers, because even at those writers' conference, they were talking about the importance of cinema, why we need a cinema, etc., etc. Right, yeah. And what they were speaking about was, as one African theorist, historian, Farid Bougadir from Tunisia said, he says it was about capturing, and as he put it, the cultural space, recapturing, or as he said, reconquering the African cultural space. But importantly also, it was an economic space. And thirdly, it was a sovereignty, exercising sovereignty, independence. So when we talk about African anti-colonial cinema, and I was saying as a collection of ideas for assessing what we have now, it's really not saying this is good or this is bad, this is African or this is not African, but saying, for example, how do these films or this filmmaker contribute to the reconquering of cultural space? How does this film or this filmmaker respond to or help us understand the conquering of economic space? Today, Netflix is buying everything. Think about that, okay? That's another. And thirdly, how does this or that filmmaker or film help us to understand expression or execution of African sovereignty, independence, self-determination? So it provides a way of evaluating. And I want to put that in the context of Fanon. Because when I say evaluating, I don't mean condemning, right? We all work within the limitations of our time. And Fanon says something like every generation has to find its way to execute its mission. So when we look about what happened in the 1950s, we can say, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. The question is, what are you doing now, basically? And that's what Fanon is basically saying. It's not worth criticizing your elders. It's about learning from them, learning their context, and trying to maximize your ability to fulfill your historical mission. Yeah? Okay. So out of that comes people like the people referred to as the pioneers of African cinema. Pauline Vera, who comes from Benin. And I mentioned 4 names which you probably don't know before I mention one that you probably know. A guy called Jacques Melo Kane. He's from Senegal. Mamadou Sarr, he's also from Senegal. And Robert Craviston. Where is he from? Martinique, in the Caribbean. These were the 4 people who called themselves the Afro-Kurd Cinema Group that made the film Africa on the Seine, Africa sur Seine in French, in 1955. Okay? And I mention that because the diaspora, we are all now different kinds of diaspora, has always been part of the definition of African cinema. Okay? The next one I want to mention, of course, Ousmane Sembène. You saw his film Mandavi. He began making his first film in 1963, a short film. He made another short film, it was called Baram Seret, about a cart driver in Dakar. Just about a guy driving, trying to make a living with a donkey cart, moving from one side of the city to another. Very humorous, but very tragic colonial situation. Then he made another film 2 years later, another short film called Le Nordeur, Black Girl. about a young girl who gets taken to Paris, to France, as a domestic worker, right? And her alienation leads to, again, a tragic end, okay? And she's working in a nice middle-class family who are thinking, saving Africa. They really want to save Africa, but in the process, this girl dies. And then Mandabi. Mandabi is the first African feature film that uses an African language. Right? His commitment was to shoot a film using an African language. And I said, who's going to understand that? Well, you put subtitles. Or learn the language. Semben is important because he's referred to as the father of African cinema, not because he was the first person to make films as an African in the post-war period, but because of his record. He's probably the only filmmaker of his generation to make more than 2 films. And that's very important. He was also instrumental with Taha Sheria from Tunisia in developing from the Carthage Film Festival and the Algerian Pan-African Congress to create FESPACO in Burkina Faso today. Okay? There's a lot of things we can fill in the dots, but just to give you a sense of how these pioneers came into being. In Britain, we had others like Lionel Ngakane and others who didn't necessarily realize their potential, but are equally important, like Edric Connor, a dramatist from Trinidad. After Sembene, you have then people like Sarah Maldoro. Again, she's from Guadeloupe, in the Caribbean. Grew up in France. She made all her films in Angola. Sambisanga is about the Angola, it comes out of the Angolan revolution and the struggle for independence against the Portuguese, etc. Equally, her first film, Mangombe, right? Another film about that. She belongs to a generation of diasporic people. Medhondo from Mauritania, grew up in France. Djibril Mambeti, Hyenas. You've seen Hyenas, that's his second and of 2 feature films he made. The first feature film, I think it's not a part 2, and it's not a sequel. This is an extension of the narrative of Tukibuki, which he made in 1973, I think. Was it? Yeah, 73, yeah. So that's one generation. Then you have another generation of people like Safi Faye and Mohamed Saleh Haroun, Balufu Bakobia Kanyanda, a friend of ours from DRC Congo. Safi Faye is from Senegal. Haroun is from Chad. And others from Nigeria, you have people like Olu Balogun, who would come into the Semben age group, still alive. And then you will have somebody, the film you're going to see tonight, which I hope to look at as well, Musese, young South African, making films in the new South Africa, new in inverted commas. Interestingly, South Africa is among a minority of countries in Africa today that has a structured film industry. And I say structured mean institutional. Nollywood is emerging from a certain chaotic new technology moment to reorganize itself in spite of its influence, phenomenal influence. But in terms of a structured film industry where development, production, distribution is coordinated in a way, Musese is a product of that, okay? With all its shortcomings. The others would be Morocco, Egypt, and other national industries which are trying in various ways to establish national film industries out of which you can constitute a Pan-African economic cinema reality, okay? Now, the last point I want to make is, I touched on it already, is about the diaspora, or diasporas. when we talk about diaspora, originally it was about Caribbean people or African Americans, slavery being, or the slave trade being the marker, right? For whatever reason, for the reasons which you know. Today, we have many diasporas, and we have to place that again into a continuum of African history, in the sense that migration is essential to African identities. There is nobody in Africa that I've met anywhere who, when you ask them, you know, what is your lineage? Where do you come from? They always tell you they come from somewhere else to where they are today. Fatuma is from Somalia, a country of nomads. Am I not right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And a country of poets and writers. But the idea of movement and migration is not alien to African realities. It has become a problem because of nation states and borders and colonialism. So our movement to the Caribbean is not problematic in itself, except that it is a forced movement. And then, you know, a movement of terror. But the idea that we have moved is not essentially problematic. We remain African because that is how African identities get made and remade. So I want to say that, to stop by saying that brings us to the present and the discussions not only about how we evaluate African cinema, but how we evaluate the Pan-African cinematic reality as a global phenomenon. We can't speak about African cinema today unless we speak about, for example, Sembène. He traveled in France, he was a soldier in the French army. Medhondo, Sarah Maldoro, Lionel Ngakane in France. We can't speak about an African cinema today unless we speak about Raoul Peck from Haiti. We can't speak about a Pan-African cinema reality unless we speak about Ouzan Palsi from Martinique. Martinique. Yes? So these are the global realities which should be natural to our own process, our own sovereign process, right? Except that we are confronting the issues of colonialism in a post-colonial situation. Africa not only has migration at its core, but diversity at its core. And when I say diversity, I'm not talking about the kind of diversity you tick in a box in the Council of Brent or somewhere like that. I'm talking about different peoples living together, okay? Ethiopians, Somalians are not the same as Ghanaians or Nigerians. Tunisians, Algerians are not the same as Congolese, right? So, but those things have never been an impediment to living together and trading over centuries. And that is the Africa we want for the future. And that's the kind of African cinema economy that we need to strive towards in order to really execute the kind of sovereignty that I think the pioneers were talking about. So, thank you.
Right. Hi, everyone. This is, I was going to touch a bit more on the historical context, but then Imruh already did that, so now I'm like, damn, I have nothing to say. I don't really know what I can actually offer you, because I think, Imruh, you have encapsulated it so beautifully.
That wasn't the intention.
No, I know, and I'm not implying that either. Encapsulated so beautifully and gone in so many different directions. So I think my presentation is going to be quite brief in answering the question that you ask about what does anti-colonial African cinema actually mean to us. I think now that Imruh has sort of laid out the wider historical context about the development of anti-colonial African cinema and why it remains even necessary to have and to rely on and depend on, I think maybe what I wanted to underscore in thinking about anti-colonial African cinema is the way in which that these filmmakers have not just employed the camera to articulate a different cultural identity, to articulate a different way of pursuing society and understanding their own frameworks against their framing in colonialism, but more so widely in how that they have actually intervened in the camera as an apparatus and as a tool of colonialism. And this is just bearing in mind, you know, first of all, not really thinking about cinema, but going back to the foresight of cinema, which is really photography and camera. I'm thinking about the way that the camera as a tool has been introduced to the African continent in the early, sorry, not early, but in the mid-1800s, I think 1865 is sort of when there's first historical documentations of a photography on the African continent. And that really happens in the context of, you know, classifying Africans, documenting Africans culturally, and trying to create these various identities in opposition to the very ways in which that whiteness constructs black people. And moving away from, you know, not just trying to talk and articulate cinema, I'm thinking about, you know, how African cinema, with its development and with its onset of the films that we're discussing today, which is Zambizanga Basara Maldoro, Hyenas by Djibril Mambeti, and sorry, what's the last film again?
This is not a burial.
Yes, It's Not Burial by Lamong, Jeremiah,
Osesi.
Actually, it's another one that I'm thinking. Mandabi, thank you. Mandabi by Ousmane Sembene. I'm thinking about how, in their breadth and in their entirety, they're all three various different films, but films that have at their core an anti-colonial framework, films that have at their core a decolonial pursuit, but also a Marxist pursuit. And in that pursuit, it's not just an attempt to invisibilize certain histories or certain narratives and certain conditions, but it's also an attempt to try to think about the camera as a tool to tell storytelling in its full breadth. So whether that is, you know, some certain camera interventions that we're seeing, or so certain use of sound and audiovisual playing such an instrumental way of articulating these histories, or even thinking about aesthetics as a framework of African cinema. And this relates particularly to Zambizanga Basara Maldoro when it was released in 1973, 1974, which received extensive criticism from film critics, particularly white film critics, for being too beautiful of a film. And I think the same can also be said for Mandabi by Ousmane Sembene, which has been, in its early on release, been extensively criticized for being too beautiful. And I think, you know, in thinking about an anti-colonial African cinema, beyond that which Imruh has already said and articulated so beautifully, I think it's also a redoing of what aesthetics mean from a perspective of cinema. What does it mean to have a film that looks beautiful and then to an extent can also be deceiving for that reason? Does it mean that the anti-colonial framework of that film is pursued loses significance? Not in any way. But I think what these filmmakers then do with these films is that they're trying to position a different way of looking at black people that goes beyond an idea of beauty, but also goes beyond an idea of what the camera has constructed of black people in its relationship to colonialism. So yeah, I think I'm going to just end it there.
I think that before we move on, it'd be good to kind of ask you a few questions about sort of like, as a curator, how you curate African anti-colonial cinema. And you did touch on the idea of aesthetics, the fact that so many of these films at their release, the biggest criticism is they were too beautiful.
Yeah.
Again, does that speak, and again, during that time, just thinking about how often, when looking at who's making that gaze, when it's the African gaze, when it's the gaze of somebody who is from that community, it's very much different to that of when you see a film. It's very clear, and I, you know, as someone who's an avid film watcher, it's very clear when, even if I don't know who the director is, it's very clear when a film is made by a black person featuring black people, or when it's made by the white gaze, appearing to kind of interpret what it is to be black. And I think that that's kind of important to think about, like, as a curator, thinking about the aesthetics of anti-colonial cinema, and thinking about like how that gaze has changed in terms of the internal gaze and external gaze when it comes to thinking about how you sort of like depictions of black people on screen, more generally, if you can answer that, or you can interpret that in any which way you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like the gaze and who gets to define and extend the gaze these days is a very difficult blurring between what is the filmmaker always actually black or is the filmmaker actually white. Because I think, as Black curators of filmmaker, we're not exempt for also reinforcing the gaze in the ways that we look at our own communities and subjects at hand. But I think, as a curator, and just going back to the whole aestheticization of the whole politics and the politics of aesthetics, I think, when I'm curating films or when I'm creating film programs, it's sometimes very easy, I think, particularly within institutional frameworks, to present a selection of films that are inherently Marxist at their core, that are decolonial, anti-colonial, and to an extent also succumb to presenting these films void of those critiques as being quite core to them, because you want to present, a different way of looking at the film canon, a different way of looking at film theory that emanates from a position of filmmakers of African descent, or that emanates from a position of filmmakers that are not white, as a way of trying to broaden the canon. But I think it's also very easy to do that whilst presenting just beautiful films, and then you don't actually censor that critique as core to it. And this is what I mean by the politicization of aesthetics. People want to see beautiful films, but they also don't want to engage with the critique of these films 50 to 60 years after they've been made. And I think what I try to do in that is that I think about what does it mean to bring these works into an institutional space? Are these films able to breathe in their fullest breath in these spaces? Are they able to be engaged within a quite, a good nuance of their contemporary relevance 50 to 60 years after they've been made? And I'm thinking about Zambizanga here specifically, which has been screened and recently restored as well. Zambizanga is such a prolific film by Sarah Maldoror, and it's great to have it within an institutional space, but it's also important to center its presence within an institutional space whilst acknowledging that it is a prolific piece of feminist, a feminist analysis of colonialism through Maria, who is portrayed by the Angolan actress Elisa Andrade. And to think about why 30 to 40 years later this film still remains relevant to understand the conditions of African women within the continent. I hope that answered your question.
Definitely, I think the contemporary value of these films, but also like decouple the dangers of decoupling the aesthetic side from the actual power of the films and the meaning and message behind them is really important, particularly when there are things that become trends, and then the trend is observed rather than like what is the substantial political critique that's happening within that context. Like, what are the issues that are being experienced then and that continue to be experienced now, and are we just flattening them by just concentrating on those aspects? Or even if we are talking about them, like, is it just navel gazing, or is it because a lot of these films again were made for the purposes not only just to document and to have a political critique, but actually to be actionable and to create and to instill to bring people to action and to sort of enact social change. And so again, it's like, is contemporary African cinema doing that thing? Does it have that political bite that previous films coming out of the colonial and then the post-colonial, does it have those critiques of what's happening now, or is it just depoliticized and just aesthetic for the sake of being aesthetic?
I mean, I in my opinion think that they do. Some of them do, but I also think there's an acknowledgement of the fact that market conditions have completely changed. Infrastructure of filmmaking has completely changed, and we're also not, we're not looking at the 50s, 60s, and 70s that were so charged with so much political engagement. When I look at African cinema, I think the 60s, 70s, and leading up to the 80s, before the world economy crashes, has also had significant effects on the development of filmmaking, and it also meant that filmmakers in the past perhaps would be less compromising in terms of their work, have had to compromise in order to produce works. I don't think that the works that are being made today have any less political stance or value or importance, but I also just think that there's a different subtlety to them that those past films that we're thinking about have. And as we're speaking of that, I think particularly about Ousmane Sembène's Mandabi, which I think out of the three films that we're discussing today, it's one that has perhaps the most contemporary relevance to me, because it's a film that's made in 1963. It's 2021 there, but it's a critique in 1963 of who the state actually recognizes, who belongs to the state, and who has access to the post-independent state. and certain conditions about the way in which that Ibrahim, who's the protagonist in this film, has to go so beyond his capacity and ability to be able to access this limited fund that's been handed to him by a cousin that's working in France or by a nephew that's working in France. These are conditions that still remain today.
Definitely, I think you're right about that contemporary element to it, but also just like there's, before I move on to Tomisin, that, you know, in terms of the kind of political critiques that we can make now, is that like film was the medium in a way that now, like, and this is maybe another element to think about, is that the ways in which like social media then becomes a place where people then explore these ideas because they can reach people in the same ways as people in the past could reach people through film. It's like you're able to kind of engage with an audience and have critiques and talk about you know, the current situations we have now. And so like, does that sort of dilute the power of film, the fact that like we're now connected in ways that we were not connected in previously?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to think just further. But yeah, I'll have to think further about that question. But I would say, just before you move on to Tomisin, though, that I think, you know, at the core of understanding anti-colonial African cinema is the perfect case study of like Fanon, really, or Fanonian case study in all these three films that we're discussing today, which is that they prioritize the masses, they prioritize working class people at their core. And, you know, they're not done with the intention of just merely critiquing some of the elitist structures that remain even in a post-independent framework, but they're also articulating the awakening of working class people, understanding the conditions that they exist within. And I think, you know, in just perhaps supplementing this with some kind of literary framework, I think Fanon's Wreath of the Earth articulates that quite beautifully, as these films do, in that relation of understanding anti-colonial African cinema.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And so I realized I did not start my presentation by thanking Awa for the invitation, and to Rob as well for creating the space, and Fatuma as well for moderating. And also June, who sat at the back here. It's nice to see you again, June. I was talking to Imruh earlier, and I was saying that, you know, as a curator, in order to speak about curating African cinema, it's very difficult to do so without also acknowledging that there have been curators like June who've been doing this work way before me, and there's an intergenerational aspect to that curatorial work as well. So thank you to you both. Yeah.
I feel like I've just been in an African film class. I was just like, firstly he just, you know, gave us this masterclass, and then so I didn't know what to say ultimately. What I can add, you know, to this, it's just humbling being here. You know, thank you to Rab and Arwa for this platform. And I was saying earlier, it's very rare that you have platforms like this, you know, where you can discuss film. Like, I love what they do, and they're passionate about it, and it's a regular thing. Sometimes these platforms, like one every 5 years, and we're older and grayer every time we meet. We're like, why is this happening, in a sense? So the fact that this is a consistent thing that you guys are doing, thank you so much, because we need this. You know, I feel like I'm gonna go home, and some titles he was mentioning, I was like, I haven't seen these films. You know, I was like, you know, all these incredible films that I didn't get access to. Just to start my own point, what you said earlier, I saw this image on Beyonce's album of basically she's on a bike with Jay-Z, right? And I realized that I saw that image and I was like, this is from Tuki Buki. And I was like, Tuki Buki is a masterwork, you know. I mean, Mbeti made this film in the 70s, and this film was groundbreaking. And I've asked a lot of my friends, do you know what this image from? They're like, from Beyonce's album. I'm like, but do you know the history behind the image? And that saddened me, because I'd seen the film, and when I showed my friends where the image was inspired from, they're like, wow, I've never heard of this before. And I just thought, this is the reality of like life right now, where ultimately people don't acknowledge the references that inspired us. I know Beyonce mentioned it in some press, but she didn't really highlight the importance of this film and how groundbreaking it was. And I think that I wasn't surprised, but I think that what it did also do is a lot of people looked back and thought, you know, let me actually like research this. And so people actually watched the film. The film actually it was trending, I think, 2 years ago, and people were like, you know, talking about the film. So in that sense, it has that kind of insight. But equally at the same time, though, I think that we take from the past, but we don't acknowledge the impact of the past. My own sort of journey into this, and in the context of this topic, you know, I mean, I'm Nigerian, and I'm a filmmaker. You know, and for me, my journey into making the kind of films I'm making now, you know, for me, the basis was Francophone African cinema. You know, I grew up, you know, in this country. I came when I was 12 years old, and I was just watching American films, you know, like Star Trek, Star Wars, you know, all the classics, you know. And I thought, this is all there is, you know. It was great to watch these films. And when I went to university, I did a course in film theory. Because for me, I wanted to make films, but I thought I need to understand the history of cinema. You know, so I took classes on Italian cinema, French cinema. It was a transformative experience for me. But at the end of my third year, I was like, wait, I have not seen one African film. And I remember I asked my lecturer, so, I'm black, you know, like there's, I was the only black person in my class of 45 people. And I saw, Bicycle Thief, Rome Open City, I saw, Breathless, I saw all these great films. I saw films from the 70s in America, the new Hollywood movement, and, I felt inspired. But then I was 21 years old in my final year of university, of film theory, not even like, this is film theory, the basics of film theory. And she just told me, Semben, she just mentioned Semben. I'm like, well, who is this guy? She gave me no context or history about who Semben was. I had to go away and do my own education. But the kind of films I was making at that point only had white people, because I was making films and I thought, if I had black people, I just didn't see myself reflected on screen. So I thought, I need to cast white actors, and all my films were about love and, breaking up with your girlfriend and boyfriend. That was all I was making. I was heartbroken at the time, so that sort of explained why. But there were always white people who had their hearts broken. And I'm a Nigerian brother. Like, they were like, Tomisin, why are you making films with all these white people? Right? And I'm like, because I wanted to be seen, And it wasn't until I left university that from 21 to 24, where I did my own work. I thought, you know what? Like, even my father, I asked him about African cinema. My dad was like, yeah, Nollywood was around in the 80s. I'm like that, but what titles? I don't know. I mean, you go and do your research. I'm like that, but like, you're telling me Nollywood was around, but you can't name one Nollywood film. So I had to do my own research. Everything I had to do on my own, because there was a deep interest in my own identity. I was like, and someone told me something, said, Tomisin, you're the only black person in this class. Why are you making films with white people? Why don't you tap into who you are? And I was like, well, I don't really know who that is, And my diasporic identity I realized it had to be tied into my work as a filmmaker. I didn't know my voice, but from 21 to 25, I saw, Black Girl. I saw Tukibuki. I saw all these incredible films. I discovered, their work, and I thought, wow, these men were making films in the 1960s. These films were, inherently black, passionate about their culture. And then I saw Nollywood films made in the late 80s, shot on 35mm. There's a man called Adepeju. Adepeju is a pioneer. No one talks about Adepeju, but this guy was churning out.
June talks about
Really?
it.
Thank you, June. Thank you. We need. See, you know what? I need someone here who knows Adepeju. But there's always somebody who knows Adepeju, And thank you, June, for talking about Adepeju, because no one talks about the influence of Adepeju and his work in the 80s. This guy, his background was from the theater. He had done a lot of plays, but he realized that he wanted to take his cinema to the homes of people. But he created, really, I think personally, sort of a new Nollywood movement. Before we have the new Nollywood now, Adepeju was doing this because my dad grew up watching his films. You can't name one film that he did, but he recognized it. There's a guy, Adepeju, the multi-hyphenate, who wrote, directed, starred, edited, produced, funded his films. So I just binged Adepeju's films, and I was like, this guy's films is Yoruba. I'm Yoruba. He's making films in Nigeria, and I realized that his work actually directly ties into the topic of this conversation, because he was making work that was inherently black. The films that were made in Nigeria in the 80s were made by Oyinbo people, which we call white people, ultimately, and that became my own journey, because when I was 25, I went to film school. When I went to film school, it was a master's program in filmmaking, and once again, I was the only black person in the class, and then I realized that, I realized that my identity is tied into my work, and I had to make work that reflected who I was as a person. But my experience of African cinema is from a diasporic lens, because I was born in Nigeria, but I came here when I was 12, and what happened from 12 to 25 was I was just like in all that they did, I was filtered with just Western cinema. It became the norm for me. African cinema was films that no one had ever heard of. in my film school, I would mention these films by Semben or by Sisse Mambete, but they're like, who are these people? And it made me sad, and that was part of my anxiousness about making films that were black. But I realized that the boldness, we saw Mandabi this afternoon, and the first African film in Wolof, and the ideas he posed in this film, the message, the timeliness of it, it was made in 1968, we're in 2001, and I realized the power of film, and as a filmmaker, I realized that I needed to make films not only in featuring Nigerian characters, but in Yoruba. And it was a political statement, because I was like, if Semben can do this, and they probably thought he was going to make a film in French, but he did not. He realized the importance of hearing our language, but hearing it in a universal context, seeing it playing in cinema, because Semben understood the power of cinema. This man made his films like in his late 30s. He had written these great books, but he realized that we needed to see ourselves reflected on screen, but really encapsulate the realities of life in Africa. And what I've tried to do with my own work in the past 7 years is I've tried to do that, but my lens is from being an Englishman as well as being a Nigerian man. And that part of myself is something that I've been equally wrestling with is, do I make truly African cinema? Because my films are set in Catford, in Lewisham. That's the question I asked myself. And I think I went back home for the first time in 2019, and it was a film festival where my short film was playing in, and for that week, I just saw these great Nigerian films. There's a film called B for Boy. It's probably the best Nigerian film by Chika Anadu. And B for Boy is groundbreaking because Nollywood in itself has its own journey, but what these films are saying is they are translating a very culturally specific experience, but they're universal. Because for me, film transcends cultural boundaries. Like, it doesn't matter if you're black. I watched Black Girl with my friend who's from Germany, and he could see himself reflected in Black Girl. And I realized that Semben understood that film is a universal language, but it's how you use that language. And as I'm learning more about African cinema, I'm realizing that I can use it as a tool to make work that is inherently political, but work that is bold and fearless. Because every single person that Imruh mentioned, these men and women were pioneers. They walked so we could run, and the fact that we don't acknowledge them is something that I'm trying to do inherently, but through my own voice, because as a filmmaker, you need that. So.
Thank you so much for that, Tomisin. Maybe it might be good to throw this open to the audience, and maybe to sort of ask questions to the panel. If there's anyone who wants to ask a question. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question?
Should we run around the mic?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, no.
Do you want to use this one? And then we keep this, and then we keep this.
Okay, perfect.
And then we mix.
Thank you. That was just amazing to be here today. And I have a question in terms of African cinema today, because it was quite insightful in terms of history and anti-colonial cinema. But right now, I would like to know what do you think of the voice of African cinema today? Because I feel like we filmmakers today were much influenced by Hollywood. I used to watch a lot of Nigerian movies. I'm a francophone, but we were really watching Nigerian movies that were made like, it was quite simple, but very with a lot of cultural content. But it seems like now on Nollywood, the content has changed. They shoot a lot in houses, beautiful houses. They don't show much of what they used to show. How we learned about juju and a lot of things that now they're going away from that. And as a filmmaker, I feel like we are really influenced. And then the challenge for us is much more harder than Usman's, because we have platforms like Netflix who have a lot of money, and they seem to be attracted now by our content. When you look at how they made an announcement that anybody who has content in terms of African tales. They are ready to finance it, which means they're going to control our content. I think our struggle is much more harder now because we are facing that. So I don't know if you can tell more about the voice that we have today. Thank you.
Yes, it's very interesting. I'm not getting at you. My humor is sometimes, on myself. You're speaking about content. I make films. I don't make content. However, everybody speaks about content. And that tells us not so much about what we do as filmmakers, but what the media environment is about. All pervasive. People make films on their phones. I have some students, I ask them to look at a film in preparation, and they tell me they're looking at it on their phone. They don't know what I would like to do with them. Their neck in particular. How can you look at a film on a phone? All right, just think about it. For me, a phone is a communicative, mechanism. I know you can do it. People send me TikTok. What's the difference between that film and TikTok? Which I've just learned about. Believe me, because people send me this stuff. They tell me TikTok can only be, 2 minutes or something like that, right? That's content. Go to Africa today. Go to the Caribbean today. These networks are saying, we want content. For me, it is stuff you look at, it's eye candy, and it goes out the back. Now, I'm not sure your situation today is easier than Semben. That's the other thing I want to say. It was a different situation. As I said, not many African filmmakers have made more than 2 films. Just think about it. Semben is one of them, not who else you can call. Vera was making films in 1955. He made his films in Paris, short films. Most of those guys have made, if they're lucky, 1 feature film. That feature film has not been seen, not because they didn't want it to be seen, because the infrastructure was not possible to make it seen. Right? Now, Nollywood came at a moment where you could bypass that and you can get seen. I know Nollywood guys who say, I've made 100 films. But you made 100 films, I only made 2, What does that make me? But you say your father can't call any of the titles.
Yeah.
There's
too much.
Too much content, right? Now Nollywood is changing, right? Because people realize that is good for an economy. An economy that says Nigerian has 100 million people, right? That filmmaker can make his money back in 2 weeks. The film comes to London, it goes to the Caribbean, it goes everywhere, pirated. He doesn't care. He has made his money, he has made 2 other films since that one left him. That's not an economy. You understand what I'm saying? That is why I've had these arguments in East Africa or other places. Say, look, you can't replicate Nollywood in Tanzania, for example. You don't have the sort of population. Not only that, he mentions Ade Love. Very few people in Nollywood recognize Ade Love and Ogunde and these guys who came out of theater, began to make films in a way like Sembene was a writer, wanting to reach a wider community. And they could do that in Nigeria. Sembene couldn't do that in Senegal. It's small. So there's an economy difference, okay? So Nollywood has its own problems, which is why it's come to us. It's easy now for Netflix to come in and say, look, you don't have to make 100 films. I will give you the budget that would take you to make 100 films. You make 1, and they could be happy for the rest of their life. But what does it mean? Okay? So the voice of African cinema, I would suggest to you, it's the voices. African cinema is plural. Nigeria, as he quite rightly suggests, has a long history of filmmaking that's not recognized among people who fetishize Nollywood. And I say fetishize Nollywood because Nollywood has its merits, but you couldn't put it on a big screen because you will realize that the chicken doesn't really just die like that. There's problems with the blood and so on. You know what I mean? Okay? But it works on television because, small screen and it's entertainment. Okay? Nollywood has always had people who knew about these problems. They weren't doing it because they were African. They were doing it because they understood the moment they were living in and the economy, that advantage it could afford them. This comes back to the question about aesthetics. This is what I mean by racism. African is associated with degradation, poverty, everything that's negative. So if you have a film that's beautifully shot, forget about the story, it's not African, because we are not good technicians. Cinema is an art. You have to learn it. It's a craft. There's a history. There is no, Tomisin's experience could be replicated across Africa. Let me tell you, teaching African cinema in Africa is a problem. Okay? There's no student should come out of film school and not seen a Sembène film. Just like there's no student should come out of film school and have seen a Hitchcock film. How are you going to be a filmmaker who've never seen Bicycle Thieves?
Yeah.
Italian film. What kind of filmmaker are you? Right? But you must see an African film, because that gives you a reason why you could make African films in Catford. Okay. Because it's a way of seeing, it's a way of using the camera, and it's a way of storytelling. So we can make a lot of African films are made in the diaspora. That doesn't stop them from being African films. It's about the vision you bring to the art, wherever you are, and that's the point I'm making. So the voices are there, the problems are a little different, and this is the challenge of our moment. Sembène had his problems of his moment. He didn't have mobile phones, he didn't have FedEx, and when you were shooting a film, you had to know where you were going to shoot before you shot, because the stock you had was limited. Now you turn on the camera like that and you leave it. Who is managing this camera? It's making a film, right? And there's no camera person behind it. Films are made like this, right? It's automatic focus, and it's going to run until you lock it off. In Sembène's time, and in my time too, well, some time ago, when you shot a film in 10 minutes and it's run out. So if you turn it on like that and we have a little pause to drink tea here, that's 10 minutes wasted. That's at least £100 minimum to start with. All right? And it's a lot of money. In today's money, £100 is probably £500. Let's put it that way. So what I'm saying, things have changed. What is important, as Tomisin has said, is that grounding, flawed as it was, as he went through, is still important. And the fact that he used time to educate himself to what was missing at university is critical to those African voices, which exist. Musese is, there's a few other young people coming out, living in France, living wherever. There's a film called Atlantics by Mati Diop. Amazing film. She lives in Paris. She grew up in Paris. She makes a film about young people in Senegal.
And she's the niece of Djibril Diop.
I didn't want to say that because, people say, I'm just being favored. A great filmmaker, but true, yeah, he comes out. But she makes a film about young people in Dakar and their problems of globalization. That's what the film is about. There's a young man called Obi. Oh no.
Obi,
he made a film called Mirror Boy.
Mirror Boy, yeah.
Amazing film. It's about a young Nigerian or West African who grows up here. He's going to end up in prison. His mother sends him to the Gambia. Go in the bush and, spend some time, get away from Hackney or wherever. Amazing film. Right? These are films that could be made. So, I'm saying the African voices are there, and you can make an African film wherever you are. As long as you understand that you have to overcome the intoxication of racism that may be inculcated in how you approach life. But there's a lot of interesting work being done still. And it's more than content.
Do any of you want to respond or anything like that? Okay, great. Any more questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, because I was really interested in Awa, what you said about Sambizanga being this kind of feminist film. And Sambizanga is based off a novella written by a white Portuguese-born Angolan. And so I was really interested in this idea of the camera and the ways of using the camera. What happens when it's Sarah Maldoror holding that camera? What is it that makes that difference to ascribe that sense of feminist messaging that I don't think I would to the original book?
Should I? Okay. I mean, well, one, Sarah Maldoror comes from a background in theatre, actually. She was working as a theatre performer before she even took on the camera to sort of articulate her histories. So I think, one, there's already a relationship between her background in theatre and her ability to draw on a novel to articulate that story through the lens. But also, second of all, she was working alongside her partner at that time, Mario Pito Dandrandi, who was also leader of the movement for
MPLA,
MPLA, exactly. And she was working with a crew, a film crew that were also actively working within the MPLA. So I think these three things already being in ground and sort of laying foundation for the film itself is also which that allows her to articulate a point of that film that does not emanate from a white Portuguese writer. She's a black woman who's telling the story about a black man who's working against colonialism, but also narrating a story about a black woman's experience of colonialism in situation to her partner. So I think it's already enough really to understand why her story is different to the novel that one would read.
May I just add also, you can take inspiration from anywhere. Hyenas is based on a short story by a European writer.
A white German writer.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Mambete has taken it, adapted it, and that's the whole point about adapting novels into screen. That's a very specific kind of art and process. But he has taken it and, let's say, reinterpreted the linear story in itself as an African story. And that's possible. You take inspiration from wherever you want to take it, and you make your voice, you bring your voice through.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time.
Yeah. And I think this is, Sambizanga, Hyenas, and are a few of many different examples of African filmmakers making use of white novelists' stories to articulate. I mean, the same thing could be said for Hussein Sharifa, whose daughter I've worked quite closely with curating his film. His film, Tigers Are Better Looking, is based on a novel by Jean Rhys. But it's still about the story of, unrootedness and migration and displacement from a black male perspective. So I think when it comes to like literature and perhaps the boundaries or binaries between literature and filmmaking, they're not always so bound to racial frameworks.
Well, sorry to cut you. I just want to remind us that that's what Europe has been doing. Picasso wouldn't exist without African art.
Yeah.
Modern European art, modernist art, owes its inspiration and its form to African art. That they pull out of Africa and say, this is of no use to Africans, we put it in the museum. Now we're taking it back. But it has always happened. The appropriation of African value, the denigration of Africans, but the appropriation of their value and incorporating it into European modernity is a process of colonialism. Right? And it's based on a racist idea that we know what to do with it, you don't know what's good of it. The Yoruba people or the Benin people don't know what to do with their bronzes, which they have made. We know how to keep them in the British Museum, and you come to university and we'll teach you how to dig a pit latrine in your backyard. Because that's all they do. That's what aid is about. Like, you don't know how to do that? Come on. you know. So Europe has, you know, everybody does that in life. That's the whole. Tarantino, one of the great contemporary directors, couldn't exist without blaxploitation films and Japanese, Hong Kong, Chinese cinema. Nobody says he is appropriating, he's taking, or, you know, that's the nature of, if at least he acknowledges it for those who want to listen. You know, Hollywood, unfortunately, people think Hollywood is American. Hollywood is as much German, European as anything else. Listen, look at the names of Hollywood. A lot of those directors who came out, who defined Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s were Europeans, Eastern Europeans running from Hitler, some of them.
Billy Wilder, actually.
Billy Wilder,
yeah.
Fritz Lang.
Yeah.
You know, you talk to Scorsese, he will tell you he is the filmmaker he is because he studied what the French were doing. They took note of what Latin Americans were doing, but they incorporated it into an institutional framework. And this is what makes the difference. This is what makes the difference. Everybody does it. That's the nature of art. It's a conversation, a human conversation. Only some of us are not regarded quite as human as others. That's the problem.
I've got a question. I'll be greedy. Firstly, thank you so much for being here. It's a real privilege to have you. We've been wanting to work with you for years now. Imruh and I have been having conversations for about 5 years about doing something together. So nice to
I'm
find
not
you
here. I shouldn't even be here.
So my question goes back to what Awa was saying about the beauty of those films, and that you can't help but notice them. All 4 films that we screened this weekend are like stunning. And I always do this thing when I watch these films, I always look to see who the cinematographer is. And for all 4 of the films, it's a white male European cinematographer. So my question is, and I think that often is because it's Europe that funds a lot of these films, and there's a lot of strings attached to that funding. So there might be a condition that you have to have one of our cinematographers if you want the money. And I'm just really curious about that lopsided relationship. Like, how did these filmmakers manage to make these anti-colonial masterpieces in spite of that relationship? But also, like, what impact does that have on the industry within Africa in terms of the development of people behind the camera who are not the director? So how has that relationship held back the industry in the country, in the continent, sorry?
I think that's a big problem, and it's a very important question, and it's a very important problem. And it links to the whole idea of film schools, film education in Africa. And it links to this notion or this elevation of content. All right? I've known a few cinematographers, okay? And when I went to Tanzania, we did, training programs or workshops within the festival. And guys would come in and say, oh, I'm a cinematographer. And I realized that really all they could do was turn the camera on and off. And I would then say to somebody, look, if you really want to be a cinematographer, are you prepared to spend 7 years studying? I say, what, 7 years? How can I do that? I want to earn a living. Okay, then, if you want to earn a living, turn the camera on and off. Because within the cinema industry, within the film industry, and I can name somebody now that I won't name, in Britain, who is a young black cinematographer, whom I've known for 30 years. And he spent 10 years just loading cameras as an assistant. Loading, in those days you had to load the magazine when it ran out, and you have to have one ready for when the cameraman calls you, he puts it in. He spent 10 years doing that. And in the meantime, learning, listening. What is the difference between one lens and another? If you want this room to look a certain way, how do I light it? What gels do I put on? How do I diffuse the light? Where do I put the light? Guys believe if you want something lit, you just put the camera in your face. You put the lights in your face. More light, more. It's not sometimes about less light, where you put it. It's a design. Cinematography is designing light. Now, what you say is part of the problem of some men Mambeti, they were making films without an industry. And that's the other thing we would say. They were making film without an industry. And they had to use whatever resources were possible. This is the advantage that South Africa has, because they have these institutions and are creating young people, people who can be cinematographers with 5, 10, 7 years background in their learning, because that's what it takes. Cinema is dangerous, right? Just like being a surgeon. And if you go to a guy who tells you, I'm a surgeon, but I just had a crash course on Zoom, you won't. You say you have a pain in your stomach, please, can you help? You will run, right? So why do you want to go to a cinematographer who's only had 1 week reading a manual and say shoot a film? And it's an institutional problem. This is one of the aspirations of the pioneers. They wanted to create these institutions, infrastructures. Governments were not that convinced because they say, oh, we need clean water, we need education. They didn't provide clean water, they didn't provide education, they didn't provide good cinema. That's why we are in the situation we're in. Both, all are linked. So yes, it is an issue, and again, kudos to those filmmakers to insist on their vision, but using the resources. And there's no reason where even if we had those resources, you say, oh, I only want a cameraman from Ethiopia. You might say, look, I like this cameraman who comes from Los Angeles because he does this very well and this is the film I want to make. You know what I mean? You can have that decision as well. That's an artistic decision, which anybody should have the liberty to make. But of course you want African cinematographers because they see differently, the colors are different, you know, the environment is different, and they will use the camera differently, you know. So yeah, that's a bigger problem and very important issue to be dealt with still.
I mean, I also think about someone like Midhondo, who's known today as one of the most prolific and perhaps ardent critiques of colonialism through his films. His cinematographer was Francois Canton, who was a white French man. And they've worked closely together on every single film that Midhondo produced, and one of them was Soleil Ocean, which is perhaps his most best-known films. I mean, as Imruh was saying, you know, it's really an infrastructure problem and it's really an institutional problem, but I also think it would be a shame to assume to oneself or to diminish the value or the critical impact of these works simply because there's a white cinematographer involved in its production. And you know, and I think as Imruh was saying earlier, art is really is an exchange, and it's also an exchange that very often circumvents cultural and racial boundaries and binaries as well. And every single filmmaker that we've discussed today have made use of white cinematographers, but they remain still pivotal voices in not just understanding African cinema as a field, as a canon, but also understanding film theory widely as a canon that incorporates and acknowledges the immense intellectual and artistic labor of African filmmakers. Yeah.
And I think just saying your point as well is very interesting, because when you asked that question, I went back to Adepeju and Ogunde. If you watch the films that these guys made in the mid 80s right up to the early 90s, there's a film called Living in Bondage, which is credited as the first Nollywood film. I don't agree with that personally. I think it's the first commercial film that people saw widely, but Adepeju and all these guys, they were making these films on 35mm. So this wasn't on these cameras we have now, but the DPs, I've looked it up, a lot of them were black men. Nigeria. So there was no film school in the 80s in Nigeria, but somehow Adepeju trusted his vision with these black men. And that really struck me, because you see a lot of these Netflix Nigerian films, they bring a lot of Oyibo people to shoot these films because they want it to be shot properly. They want it to look well, you know, they want their black skin to pop. There are a few Nigerian DPs who are making great work now, but the reality of the Nigerian film industry now, the new Nollywood movement, is a lot of these filmmakers, they have watched a lot of Hollywood films. They want their films to look like Hollywood, you know? So where's Hollywood? It's in, you know, the Western culture. Oh, let's get white DPs. You know, I'm writing a film right now which is set in Nigeria, and a lot of my team have been saying, yeah, Tomisin, do you want to bring in be a white person to come and shoot your film? And I was like, wait, stop. Let's I had to really be very clear about, I want to go and shoot a film in Nigeria, not just bring every white people I know in England. I said, no, I want to work with the people on the ground.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I want to compromise my vision. I'm going to work with good DPs. And there's a lot of incredibly talented DPs. You know, there's a guy called Konaté, brilliant Nigerian filmmaker.
Son of.
Yes. He made some great films, and there's a film called I can't remember the name now, but he's worked with the same black DP for his first 5 feature films. Kunle worked with this man, and you know, he actually trained at an FTS, which is one of the best film schools in the country. And I actually met him for the first time last year. And born in Nigeria, came to train in this country in his early 20s, but went back home and just he's been shooting feature films. He's been also educating people about, as you said, it's a craft. To how do you light black skin? You know, black skin takes in a lot of light. A lot of DPs that I met when I went back to Nigeria 2 years ago, you know, you can tell that when they saw my short film, they were like, wait, how did you get this color? And I just had to, they were so baffled because the educational system of film school and training people in Nigeria, they don't understand that it's a language, it's a cinematic language, and you have to understand that when you move to the right, the light changes. When you move to the left, when you walk up and down, how do you know, capture black skin? You know, and I think that unless we are dedicated and I think focused on training these black men, unfortunately, a lot of the directors just told me they're going to be getting a lot of people from France, from Spain, DPs, and I've been trying to tell them that, you know, we can learn, because in the 80s, Adelove was on film. Film is one of the most challenging mediums to shoot on. I shot my last short film on film, and honestly, it was a inspiring experience, because you realize that, you know, every time the camera rolled, I heard my money. Right? It was literally, I heard all the savings that I put up. I didn't go to holidays. I heard it on the rolling, you know, and I just stood next to the camera, just like watching it, because I'm like, wow, my money is going right now. So it changes how you even direct. It changes how you work with your actors. And to get a DP to learn how to use the camera, because it's a process, you know, the film is taken away, kept somewhere, like, and I think that we have the capacity to learn. And I think we have to want to learn. And I think that so many people are, every time I went back and they saw me, they thought, like, wow, you're so lucky that you went to film school in England. I'm like, why? Because for a whole year, I made 7 films. You know, the film school in Nigeria, like, they barely even have functioning cameras. And it's a tragedy, you know? And I think that part of what I want to do one day, hopefully, is to go back home and form some kind of like a film program, a short course where people who want to write, want to direct, how do you write a script that translates your vision? How do you light it? How do you use music? How do you use sound design? It's a craft, and I learned that at film school, even though I was watching only white films, but I still learned it. You know, I went away and did my own education. But I really think that Nollywood is capable of that, but we don't have, the people in power don't want to educate us, because they know that if we understand it, we will just take off. We can even sort of transcend our vision of what they see us as well. So.
Yeah, just
Can I,
yes. You go.
okay.
I was going to say, like, in all the archival research that I've done, usually for any project-related things, I've realized that one of the downfalls or the shortcomings of a lot of continental and African continental filmmakers is that many of them actually did not work with local African photographers. You know, we're speaking a lot about, you know, DPs, director of photography, visual direction and stuff. A lot, you know, West Africa particularly, which is where my research knowledge is a bit rooted, there's a wealth of photographers that were working quite simultaneously to these filmmakers, and I've always thought that it's insane that neither of any of these filmmakers actually employed local photographers to work with them on the direction of their photography, because filmmakers inherently have to understand light. And you have filmmakers in the 60s and 70s. And I think, you know, when we're talking about DPs today, for example, in filmmaking, there's such, you know, an interest in you know, filmmakers understanding how to lighten black skin, understanding of how do you portray black skin in film. And I think to myself, but you have photographers in the 60s and 70s who were already doing that and who were already considering that. And it's so strange that that's not a relationship that's mapped between cinema and photography.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, again, it is our duty to critique. One of the downfalls of Nollywood is that it did not recognize the link between the, let's say, post-2000 generation of digital age and the Adelov generation. Those guys were trained in Nigerian television at the time, and they were using film. So they understood. By the time Nollywood came along, some of them were old men, but nobody wanted to know them. That is the problem. They robbed, say, the commercial imperative took over to a degree that it didn't matter what the film looked like. It's just that we know we're going to make money by next week and we're going to be happy. You know, the point is Nigeria has a very strong cinematic tradition. And they've done studies, they have done research, they have done policy documents. I've read some of them. You know, people theorizing what a national film industry would be like, right? It's not, Nollywood made all of that redundant. The other thing that made it redundant is the assumption that film is a free market, free enterprise activity. Hollywood is central to the American economy, and it is central to American government policy. It could not and cannot exist in any other way. Let us understand that. It is not just people producing entertainment. This is an economic, national economic policy that facilitates the investment of substantial sums of money, which it ensures it returns by dominating the world and pushing. Go to your Odeon and see how many films are shown there. 3 films, all American, in every cinema in Britain today, right? Not more than 3, 4, 5 films. And Hollywood is producing how many films a week? Hundreds, at least 100 anyway. You're going to see in your Odeon maybe 3 or 4, which is going to make enough money to cover all of those that have lost money. That's the economy. And it keeps thousands of people in work. That's the economy. They get tax breaks, they get whatever. Could you imagine? Hollywood could not exist without the cooperation of the American military. The military has departments dedicated to facilitate films and filmmaking. That's how they make Dune. That's how they make war films. That's how they make all of this stuff. That's why a guy can put a false bullet in a gun and shoot his friend the other day. Because, you know, they're playing with real ammunition, which has the regulatory, the regulatory process failed. That's what happened there. But the only way you can have those kinds of firearms or any kind of firearms on a film set is if the government permits it. The regulatory process failed in that case, tragically. But that is how Hollywood exists. It's not an accident. Okay? It's not an accident. You can't crash helicopters and get away with it easily. Okay? So this is the whole idea. This is what I'm saying. The Nigerian film governments and African governments don't understand that that is an economy. It is part of an economy, a creative economy. That's what they call it, creative economy. And comes back institutions and so on. So issues much bigger than us, but we should be aware of them and not feel like kind of inferior that we can't meet those standards. It is not rocket science. There's real reasons why we can't do that. And we can work that out. Yeah? Which is why we still fight for what we fight for.
We have one more question before we close off the night.
Just a quick response to what you said. I went to the same school, film school as Tomisin. I studied cinematography, and we didn't spend a single day of learning how to light dark skin tones, so it's definitely an institutional problem.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I will tell you one cinematographer later who spent 2 years at film school with me just doing nothing but that. And he's still working today, a good friend of mine. And he's not African.
Okay, we're going to have 2 more questions before we end.
Okay, well, firstly, I want to say thank you. It's such a privilege to learn from you all. I'm just very curious if you're happy to share your personal favourite films from the continent. Just one favourite today.
What's your favourite?
I have the mic, so. Okay. It's a favorite African film, but it's not from the continent. My favorite personal film, and spontaneously, is Rukasnek, Uzan Palsi. And if you ever see that film, that's an amazing African story from the Caribbean. An amazing African story. And I get moved by it every time I see it. Yeah.
Can you repeat the name? Sorry.
It's called Rukasneg. The other English is called Black Shack Alley or Sugarcane Alley. The Americans call it Sugarcane Alley. But it's really Black Shack Alley. And in French it's Rukasneg. Yeah. Black Shack Alley, yeah. Or Sugarcane Alley. Uzan Palsi, yeah. It's a coming of age story. Yeah.
I have quite a few, but if I have to narrow it down to just two, it would be.
What did she say? Two?
I have two. I can't give you just one. That's
I'll
impossible.
give you
for
one
me.
for now. The other one.
One of them is it's called De Cierta Manera, One Way or Another, by an Afro-Cuban filmmaker called Sarah Gomes.
Indeed.
And I think that's perhaps one of the most brilliant films I've ever seen, not just in terms of like the storytelling of it, but also just in terms of how it's a film that really deals with architecture and the development of a city. And then the other one, oh my God, this is so difficult. The other one is actually a film called Insan, called Human Being by Ibrahim Shaddad, a Sudanese filmmaker who was part of a generation of filmmakers that came out of the country in, between the 60s and 80s really, and is part of the Sudanese Film Collective alongside several colleagues of his. And it's one I've seen obsessively so many times and I never get tired of it. It's visually so stunning. And it's one of those few, I think, very, very great examples of African cinema where there's actually no narrative, but it relies on sound and audio techniques to actually tell the story. And it does so beautifully.
I would have to lean close to home, I think for mine. Because I've also got like a lot, but it's hard to narrow it down to one. But it's a film that I mentioned earlier, actually. It's called B for Boy. B for Boy. And I saw it randomly because on Netflix there's an onslaught of films. And I always just try and find it. The black faces. So let me just try and find and the black films are African American films, I mean, there's some really great ones there. But B for Boy 2017 or 2018, I was just browsing Netflix and I was like, wait, I saw the name Chika Anadu. I was like, wait, that's an Igbo name. It's like great. It's like, and I thought, let me just watch it. It was 85 minutes long, and honestly, like, she trained at NYU, I think, and you can tell that she understands the craft because I've never seen Nigeria captured in the way that she did. She captured it. It's so subtle and nuanced. And if you watch Nollywood films, there's no subtlety. It's exaggerated because we're, very overt beings, And but B for Boy, the main character is this middle-aged woman, which we never see in Nollywood films. It's always about men, But it's such a powerful film, and I highly recommend it. I don't know where you can find it because it's not on Netflix anymore, but you could probably find like a link somewhere.
Can I say? I also want to say, as we're speaking about anti-colonial African cinema, do you bear in mind that like curators like June, Giovanni, and so many others are working so ardently towards making these works accessible to people? So I think we can't sit and discuss this and then pretend that there's an entire issue of inaccessibility when the work is actually being done. You just have to find it.
Yeah.
And I also want to add, like at CAS, which is my platform, we have a free open source film list where you can see over 200 films for free. Yeah? So accessibility is an issue, but it's not the same issue that it was 5 or 10 years ago. And I think people have to widen that scope as well when they discuss inaccessibility. The work is being done.
We've got one last question at the front.
Hey, thank you guys. I really appreciate all your energies and the wisdom you provided. So thank you. I just wanted to say one of the questions. I wrote a few, but I think it was good to round us off. I was just wondering what you talented African elders can provide wisdom on. What do you think we should do with the culture that was built with colonialism? Because there's also a lot of culture that we inherit and that we wear that was stemmed from the colonial, colonial force to our own, ways of living. And what do you think we should do with it today? Because as you was talking, I was just thinking, reflecting about just what if, like, you know, I attended a school that, you know, put me first and showed me showed me my culture first. But that wasn't the case in my upbringing. There was a lot of force mental, indoctrination force, and even my mum, she has a culture that I believe is there because of colonialism. So but it's not we don't want to necessarily just forget it, but at the same time, sometimes I don't feel that connected to it. So what do you think we should do with the culture that's built from colonialism?
You want me to answer?
Yeah.
You sure? Forgetting is not an option. It's very important to remember, because you can't forget what is actually in you. For me anyway, and I'm just talking about what I think works for me, and I guess I've been reflecting on probably similar things. And we all have whatever we have, or come from wherever we come from in whatever way. If the pioneers of African cinema stopped to think about that, would they make the films they made? They all went to colonial schools. Sembene was in the French army. They all went to France at some point, worked as a docker, etc. I think it's understanding what your mission now is and what you are part of, the history that you're part of. It's not a history to be forgotten, but something to learn from and take forward. And I say to myself, whatever little I do with June in conversation is not for me. It's for people who are coming after me. You're contributing to a process, a history, and just hope that you leave something worthwhile. That's what I'm saying. Fanon said, it's not worthwhile criticizing your elders who've gone before you. It's important to learn from them, understand their context, and then use what is useful, discard what is not useful, and go forward. Because your children are going to judge you. They're going to ask you, you are the elders of tomorrow. So your children are going to say, what did you do on the 13th of November in Wembley Park? Justify your existence from that time. And you're going to say, oh, I was criticizing my grandmother. You say, well, but what did you do after that? They're going to ask you that. So I don't know if I have the correct answer when my so-called whatever in the future asks me that question, but I'm hoping that I will have something that will say, okay, you're all right. We don't mind being part of you. And that's really what you can do. The point is, this is what I come back to, anti-colonialism. What is our objective here? Cultural space, reconquering our cultural space, reconquering our economic space, and expressing our sovereignty. Now, I don't have a theory how you do that, or a guideline on how you do it, but you've got to aim for it. And you might live to the next 10 years, you might live to the next 10 hours, we don't know, do we? You might live to 100. The point is, every moment has to be part of creating that future. Because it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about the future. It's always going to be about that, which is why we talk about archives. All these guys, some men, they live their lives were in no way perfect. Believe me, their lives were tough, all of them. But it left something for us to be discussing today, and we hope that people will do that in the future. Hence, your other question, the other film I like is a film called Darat, because it's linked to some way to what you were saying. Darat is a story about a young boy trying to seek revenge against an older man. It's a film by Mohammed Saleh Haroun. And if you, for example, read from an Islamic point of view, it's about forgiveness and how you move on beyond revenge. And I think it's an amazing film. A slow, it takes place in Chad, and it's about this young boy who's been sent to take revenge for his father. And he ends up having to make a big decision. I won't tell you the story. But it's a beautiful film. Beautiful film. Dry season. Darat or Dry Season. You'll see the English title, Dry Season.
It's on CAS's film list, or you can see it for free.
Okay. For free?
Yeah.
I'm coming there. Beautiful film.
Yeah, very.
Does anyone have anything else to add? Okay, and with that, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to our panel.